Welcome to Watsonville, California. It was just after 8 a.m. on the morning of February 2nd, 2016, when our friends at the now defunct Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay Railway began their day by firing up locomotive number 89. A former Milwaukee Road EMD GP9, the vintage locomotive was built in 1959 and was acquired by Iowa Pacific Holdings when they purchased the Mount Hood Railroad in 2008 under the name Permian Basin Railways. The locomotive was transferred from the Oregon Tourist Railroad to the Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay in 2012. With the demise of Iowa Pacific, the locomotive was again relocated to Alamosa, Colorado, where it currently resides in a state of uncertainty. As of May 2021, the locomotive is for sale by Ozark Mountain Railcar. Number 89 was used to pick up a lone center beam car from the Big Creek Lumber Company just west of town. The empty car would be taken for interchange at Union Pacific's Watsonville Junction Yard to the east of town. To get there, the train would street run down Walker Street through the very heart of Watsonville. The Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay was an Iowa Pacific owned and operated Class 3 shortline railroad that provided freight service to businesses along the shores of California's Monterey Bay. Iowa Pacific Holdings was formed in March of 2001 to acquire railroads and create rail-related businesses. Iowa Pacific focused on smaller feeder railroads with annual revenues of $10 million and less. The company successfully acquired 8 railroads in the United States and 2 in the United Kingdom. Founded by former Amtrak executive Ed Ellis, among other investors, the company struggled financially for the majority of its existence due to bad investments and business practices. The company earned the nickname IOU Pacific, which was coined by rail fans and disgruntled employees who were frustrated with the company's poor management strategies. With Iowa Pacific's mounting debt problem and other financial woes, Progressive Rail created the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad and took over the common carrier responsibility from the Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay in August of 2018. Construction started on the Santa Cruz Railroad in 1873 and was completed in 1876 as a narrow-gauge railroad. The Santa Cruz was later acquired by Southern Pacific in 1881 and shortly thereafter was converted to standard gauge. Southern Pacific ultimately acquired other lines into Santa Cruz, but before the SP was merged into Union Pacific in 1996, only the 32 miles between Watsonville Junction, Santa Cruz, and Davenport remained. The line was eventually purchased by the Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission. In 2012, Iowa Pacific was selected to operate the line, and service commenced in November of that year. Some of the key commodities shipped by rail on this line are lumber, frozen food, and input for biodiesel processing. The railroad is known for its scenery. At several locations, the line hugs the Pacific Ocean and features well-known trestles at La Selva and Rio del Mar. At one time, the Santa Cruz also operated seasonal excursion trains and planned to expand passenger service, but those plans were never realized. After dropping off the center beam car, Locomotive 89 returned as light power. We again caught the lone Jeep 9 as it ran down the middle of Walker Street amid busy traffic. We were grateful to the management team at the Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay Railway for hosting us and allowing us to mount a camera on the locomotive. While the railroading scene in Watsonville has changed drastically in the last 5 years, even more change is expected, with murmurings of another short line operator taking over from Progressive Rail in the very near future. After spending the morning chasing the short line around the bay, we found a Union Pacific local south of Gilroy on the Coast Subdivision with 2 former Southern Pacific GP60s for power. The local freight was making track speed through the countryside as it continued northward. It was great to see a pair of veteran EMDs still earning their keep on the Coast Subdivision. In the evening, we decided to head north for San Francisco Bay, where we would rendezvous with a couple of local area rail fans in the morning for an exciting day on another California short line. Located on the southeast side of the city, the San Francisco Bay Railroad is a Class 3 short line that operates over 5 miles of track in the city and port of San Francisco. The short line interchanges exclusively with Union Pacific and has the capacity to store up to 300 cars. They're also capable of loading over 60 rail cars every day. Primary commodities hauled by the Bay Railroad consist of dirty dirt and various wastes and construction debris from their sister company, Waste Solutions Group. They also took over switching tallow for a nearby industry for Union Pacific. The San Francisco Bay has historically also handled aggregates, biodiesel, cement, rail, ties, containerized cargo, and other wastes. At the time of our visit, the short line used 2 Alco S2 switchers for their everyday work, and the crews were very rail fan friendly. So much so that we were invited into the cab of locomotive number 23 by our friends Sam Tannenbaum and Danylo Hawks. At the throttle was engineer Sam Tannenbaum, and directing the train's movements was Danylo Hawks. Although the 2 men no longer work for the Bay Railroad, they enjoyed their time together and made for a great team. With the 2 experienced railroaders guiding the locomotive, we would slowly make our way to the yard office and into the middle of the yard. The San Francisco Bay Railroad actually uses goats to keep the vegetation down in the yard, so you'll occasionally see imported wildlife while watching the crews build their trains. Alco S2 number 23 was built in March of 1944, while the railroad's other S2, number 25, was delivered over a year later in July of 1945. A unique spotting feature of number 23 are its front horizontal shutters, as most S2s were delivered with vertical shutters. Riding in this antique locomotive was a special experience. At the time, number 23 was 72 years old, making it older than many mainline excursion steam locomotives, including Nickel Plate Road 765. Its age is a testament to Alco's design and the railroad's maintenance. Hopping on at the south end of the yard, we would take a slow ride to 3rd Street before jumping on a section of track that runs literally right down the middle of the road. Before leaving the yard, any train that travels on this section of track must await clearance to cross a double-track light rail system on 3rd Street. This diamond is governed by signals on timers. If there are no light rail trains in the area, the Bay Railroad is given a clear signal, and the light rail system is given stop signals on each main. As we traveled down the street running section, you can definitely tell that trains can be a surprise to local drivers. Bay crews frequently laugh when seeing the reaction of motorists who aren't always expecting to see a large locomotive running down the middle of the street.
All right.
The San Francisco Bay Railroad has a history that spans over 130 years. In 1889, the Board of State Harbor Commissioners laid the first track for a new railroad called the State Belt. The short line would play a key role in San Francisco's waterfront development for over 80 years. Before the track was even laid, the land along the waterfront didn't exist, which is why it wasn't included in the original survey of the city. As a result, the fill along the bay would become property of the state of California, hence the name the State Belt Railroad. In the early days, the State Belt was completely isolated from the North American rail network. All cars were ferried in from around the bay. The original tracks were dual-gauged, which allowed the belt to transfer both narrow and standard gauge freight cars to and from both the North Pacific Coast and the South Pacific Coast railroads. Nearly 25 years after the first track was laid, the belt finally connected with Southern Pacific in 1913 at a small yard located at Townsend and Berry Streets. That same year, State Belt constructed a small 5-stall concrete reinforced roundhouse on the corner of Sansom Street and the Embarcadero. The building was renovated in 1984 to look closer to its original appearance and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1986. The roundhouse still stands today as an office building, but the nearby yard tracks were removed in the early 1990s. When built, the roundhouse stored a modest number of oil-fired steam locomotives that were used to serve the many industrial piers along the city's waterfront. Later on, the State Belt's Alco S2 diesels were stored in the roundhouse. In addition to a modest locomotive roster, the railroad also owned 4 freight cars, which were idler flat cars. These cars were used to keep the State Belt's heavy locomotives from rolling onto the car ferries. The short line's ferry slips were located near Fisherman's Wharf on the north side of the city. The 1915 Panama Pacific World's Fair and additional rail traffic to Fort Mason justified the construction of a tunnel, 1,500 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 22 feet high underneath the Fort Mason Military Reservation. Eventually, tracks were extended across what is now the Marina District to Crissy Field to serve the Presidio. The tunnel portals remain to the present day, but are fenced off from public viewing. In the 1920s, the Santa Fe built a car ferry operation in China Basin. To connect with the Class 1 railroad, State Belt built a connection track by way of 3rd Street and the Mission Creek Drawbridge. This connection helped increase the belt's overall business. In addition to the Santa Fe, the State Belt also interchanged with the Northwestern Pacific and Western Pacific railroads, giving its customers a variety of Class 1 connections. As with many railroads at the time, World War II increased trans-Pacific traffic, including freight and passenger rail. Aiding in the wartime effort, the State Belt served the military by moving troops, weapons, fuel, and other materials. In addition to its own locomotives, the Army and Navy provided more locomotives to allow the railroad to handle increased traffic. The State Belt also moved troop trains to debarkation points and picked up hospital trains with wounded soldiers. They also handled returning troops by handing trains off to the Class 1 railroads. In 1945, the State Belt moved a total of 156 troop trains and 265 hospital trains. After the war, industries along San Francisco's waterfront slowly relocated across the bay to Oakland. By 1969, California wanted out of the port business, so the city of San Francisco voters approved a bond issue to purchase the Port of San Francisco. As a result, the State Belt became the San Francisco Belt. 4 years later, in 1973, the city offered to sell the railroad to any operator for just $1. After more than 6 months of searching for a new operator, the city signed a 20-year contract with Kyle Railways to operate the railroad. By this time, belt trackage was down to 58 total miles, a loss of 9 industrial track miles. Toward the end of its existence, local rail fans nicknamed the struggling short line the Tunerville Trolley and the Wooden Axle Line. By 1993, when the San Francisco Belt ceased operations under Kyle Railways, most of the tracks north of the ferry building were either removed or inactive. The only remaining rail activity took place at Pier 96, a newly built container facility near Hunters Point. Alco S2 number 23 was chosen to serve the facility and was given a new number 49, and a new paint job in 49er colors. At the same time, Alco number 25 began a long-term loan from the Port of San Francisco to the Golden Gate Railroad Museum at the Hunters Point Shipyard. Not long after, number 49 was also loaned to the museum. The two Alcos joined State Belt Steam Engine number 4 as part of Golden Gate's San Francisco Railroading Heritage Collection. In 2000, the San Francisco Belt Railroad was renamed the San Francisco Bay Railroad, and both of the State Belt's vintage Alco locomotives were sent back to the port to serve the repurposed ICTF yard in 2004. In addition to some minor repairs to the number 23 and 25, the railroad decided to convert both locomotives to use biodiesel fuel. This made the San Francisco Bay Railroad the first railroad in the United States to exclusively operate on biodiesel. Going even greener, the Bay Railroad added Knoxville Locomotive Works SE10B number 30 to the roster. The Tier 4 compliant switcher now handles all switching duties at Pier 96. Unfortunately, as part of the grant agreement between the Bay Railroad, the Port of San Francisco, and the state, number 25 was rendered inoperable by torching a hole in the block. It's now on display in the entryway to the Dirty Dirt Yard. Number 23 has been relegated to being a backup locomotive, but hasn't been used with any regularity since the KLW locomotive arrived in March of 2019. Today, Union Pacific's local train, the YSF 70, would meet the San Francisco Bay Railroad and interchange at the yard. This local is affectionately named the South City Switcher and can usually be seen multiple times throughout the week, interchanging with the unique short line. Another interesting aspect of this branch is that it street runs for most of the distance to the interchange on Rankin and Quint streets. At Rankin Street, the crew of the UP local must wait for Sir Costa Iron and Metals ground employees to clear the tracks before proceeding to the interchange point. This street is extremely busy throughout the day, and mass chaos always seems to ensue once trains arrive on the branch. While waiting for the UP local to return with outbound cars, we camped out on the corner of Quint Street and Davidson Avenue. Before jumping back onto the main, we caught the train from the Oakdale Avenue overpass with the city in the background. After shooting the Union Pacific local, we paid a quick visit to the Cable Car Museum in the Nob Hill neighborhood. This museum was a great look into the city's amazing public transit system with a history spanning over 130 years. Here, the giant cables that move the cars are still in operation and can be viewed from a platform. After our visit to the museum, we drove about 40 minutes across the bay to see the Richmond Pacific Railroad. This included a trip over the world-famous Golden Gate Bridge. The Richmond Pacific Railroad is the successor of the Pier Terminal, and its primary function is to serve the Levin Richmond Terminal. The railroad acquired a large amount of trackage from Southern Pacific that the Class I was no longer interested in operating. The short line interchanges with BNSF and Union Pacific and are known for transporting chemicals and export Rocky Mountain region coal to South America. Unfortunately, when we arrived, the crew had just finished their work for the day and were tying down the power. Upon leaving the yard, we caught a BNSF light power move with heritage from both the BN and Santa Fe. Later in the evening, we documented several Amtrak trains by the C&H Sugar Plant in Crocket, California. The line we're on is the former Southern Pacific, referred to by local area buffs as the Cal-P, which is short for California Pacific Railroad, the name of the fallen flag railroad that built this portion of the Southern Pacific. It's known officially as Union Pacific's Martinez Sub. The line sees Amtrak's Capital Corridor service, which runs primarily between San Jose and Sacramento, but 2 trains per day extend as far as Auburn, so it's really an Auburn to San Jose service. The Capitals are considered long-distance commuter trains and have enjoyed surging ridership since their inception. These trains make for some of the best on-time service on the entire Amtrak system. The line also sees San Joaquins, which run between Oakland and Bakersfield and serve the Central Valley. In addition, Amtrak's California Zephyr and Coast Starlight trains operate over the Martinez sub. Although a major corridor for Union Pacific freight trains, it's primarily known as a passenger line. Moving to the Pacific coast, we captured one last train as the sun dipped below the horizon. West Central California certainly offers rail fans a tremendous amount of variety between mainline, shortline, freight, and passenger rail. Our trip to the coast wouldn't have been successful without our friends at Iowa Pacific and the San Francisco Bay Railroad. These two short lines put on quite the show and are on the top of our list for the next time we visit the area. We hope you enjoyed watching our second episode of Wild West Railroading. Thank you for watching Delay in Block Productions. Until next time, happy railroading.